I could not be any happier that 2020 is over and we're 2 months into 2021. I'm not going to pretend like all the problems of 2020 have just disappeared, but let's be honest, we appear to be headed in the right direction. 2020 was just an absolute, the worst year. If I live to be 500, I hope I never see another year like 2020, right? Don't go here, don't go there, don't do this, don't do that, stay here, do this, do that, don't do this. All this kind of, it was just a complete mess and disaster, whether you believe everything that everyone said about what was going on or whether you believe none of it, it affected us all the same. It was just an absolute disaster. And we're slowly starting to get things back in 2021 that we lost in 2020. And while I understand that football, college football, or football in general may be pretty low down the totem pole in terms of things that are important in life. I mean, you talk about your family, your health, your happiness, success at your career, things. I understand those things are obviously hugely important to everyone. But college football has a place. You're here because you're a college football fan, right? I truly believe that college football provides, at least for me, a much needed and important distraction from the grind of just everyday life, whatever that is for you or for me, paying bills, raising kids, a family, managing just the everyday, just sort of ho-hum routine of life. College football provides a much needed break and distraction. And while I was happy that we had college football this past season, let's be honest, it was not the same. A lot of things were taken away. Tailgating, packed stadiums, non-con games. And that's what I want to talk about in today's video, non-con games. Now, I've always enjoyed non-conference games. They're a great part of every college football season. And of course, we had to do without that this past year. I don't think I realized exactly how much I liked or enjoyed non-conference games, though, until I went a year without it. You know the expression, you don't know what you have until it's gone? I don't think I realized how much I enjoyed these non-conference games, right? And we know why we love non-con games, right? For all the obvious reasons. You get to see matchups that maybe normally you don't get to see. Sometimes you get lucky and you get a matchup with two highly ranked teams. Sometimes you get a non-con game that sort of rekindles maybe an old rivalry that for whatever reason has gone away. This upcoming season, when you look at the non-con schedule, we've got plenty of games that fit into all of those categories. In today's video, I'm going to run through the 10 non-con games in the 2021 college football season that I'm looking forward to watching the most. Maybe these aren't the 10 best non-con games of 2021, but they're the 10 that I'm looking forward to watching the most. And then I'll rattle off a list of some of the other ones too that are obviously worth watching. Let's go. Good morning and that, but it's Uncle Lou here. That's right, it's me, Uncle Lou, and I'm live for you on LouTube today. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also, and in addition to that as well. The weather is amazing. Again, today, I don't know what to do with this weather. 2 days in a row here, 80 degrees, sunny, not a cloud in the sky. This is after what seems like 2 months straight of 45 degrees and rain down here in Augusta, Georgia area. This weather is just unbelievable. I know it's not springtime yet, and we're going to have another couple of cold snaps, I'm sure, before the weather starts to look like this all the time, but I'll take it. And it happened on a weekend, too, on a Saturday and Sunday. It couldn't have worked out any better. Just the weather's just been absolutely amazing. But let's get into these non-con games. Now, I don't have these in any particular order. I sort of just went through the entire college football schedule, starting with week 1 and all the way to the end, and wrote down a big long list of non-con games. And then I narrowed that list down to about 15 or 20 games. And then I picked out the 10 I was most excited to watch this coming year. So when I go through this list of games, these games are just in the order that they're played. They're not in any particular order. So the first game I mentioned isn't the one I'm the most excited about necessarily. It's just the one that gets played first. So this is just in time order, date order, chronological order, if you will. And I know you will. You have to start with the obvious one, Alabama versus Miami. Now, this is an interesting game for a couple of different reasons. You know, defending champ Alabama, undefeated last year, right? 13-0, wins another national title. They take on Miami. Now, Miami hasn't been a great college football team lately. I mean, I'm stating the obvious here. Everyone knows their struggles over really the last, coming up on 20 years now. They did win the national title back in the early 2000s, But since joining the ACC in the mid-2000s, they've really struggled. They've won, I think, one bowl game in the last 15 or 16 years. They've yet to win the ACC in the 15 or so years that they've been there. They've won their division only once. They've got some really embarrassing losses. It's been a constant turnover at the head coach position there. But I do think Miami has some reason to be optimistic heading into 2021. They keep their coaching staff intact for the most part. De'Aaron King made the decision to return, which I think is a good thing for Miami. When he first transferred there, I think it was sort of understood it was going to be kind of a one-and-done thing. He, of course, played at Houston for a couple of years and was a very exciting player. Wanted to transfer to the Power 5 and sort of prove himself to the NFL. I thought he had a pretty good year. Maybe could have been a little bit better, but again, you got to keep in mind it was his first year in the system, things like that. It was a weird offseason, so he didn't have that much time to acclimate to the new system. He makes the decision to come back, coming off a unfortunate injury that he suffered in the bowl game. Now, clearly, Bama's going to be a big favorite in this game, right? But it's still an interesting game. These two teams played. The last time they played, wasn't it the 1992 national title game? Wasn't it? I believe it was. Alabama beat them, of course, winning the national title. I think that was the last time they played. Did I write down their? Let's see. Did I write this down? Bama leads the series 14-3 all time. 1993 was the last meeting. They play September 4th in Atlanta. Miami was 8-3 last year. Alabama undefeated, but Alabama loses their quarterback Mac Jones. They lose several of those elite wide receivers. They lose Najee Harris. They always lose a couple of offensive linemen in the NFL. But we know how they've recruited over the last 15 years. They're not hurting for talent. Miami, on the other hand, gets a ton of starters back off of what I think was a pretty good year last year for Miami. Now, it didn't end well. They lost yet another bowl game. They've one bowl win in the last 15 or so years. That is hard to believe for the Miami, man. They lost in the Cheez-It Bowl to Oklahoma State. So, although the season didn't end well, 8-3, when you look at Miami's record over the last 15 years, you're not going to find very many records better than 8-3. I know a couple of years ago they won the division and had 10-plus wins. Outside of that, this past season was probably the second best season they've had since joining the ACC. This is going to be tough for Miami. I mean, let's just be honest. Nick Saban with basically 8 months to prepare for this game going up against Nick Saban is a huge disadvantage anyway. Going up against Nick Saban when he's got 8 months to prepare is nearly impossible. You can go back and look at Nick Saban's records in these opening week games, and he's had a few against big-time Power 5 opponents, and the majority of these games don't wind up not being very close. But still, I think you have to include this game in a list of any interesting non-con games you're looking at for 2021. All right, up next, also on opening weekend, September 4th, another neutral site game, this one in Charlotte. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because I have a feeling we'll be talking about it a lot this offseason on this channel, but Clemson versus Georgia in Charlotte. Now, Georgia has dominated this series all time, but all time's not playing this game this coming year. 2021 is the only teams playing this coming year, but Georgia does lead the series 42-18. Georgia won the last meeting back in, I think it was 20, did I write it down? 2014? 40, I think it was 45-21. We've played Clemson twice in the 2010s and twice in the 2000s. We were 2-0 against them in the 2000s and 1-1 against them in the 2010s. So Georgia 3-1 against Clemson this century, winning the last matchup. Clemson, though, obviously a much better team and a much better program right now than in any of those previous four matchups that you want to look at for this century. So you can't look at that to judge. I'm just giving you the win-loss, the overall series records for a lot of these matchups that I'm talking about. This will be a great game. Yes, Clemson loses Trevor Lawrence, but although it was bad at the time, Trevor Lawrence's injury this past season, now that becomes a huge benefit for Clemson in my mind. Their young kid, DJ Ukulele, he had to step in when Lawrence went down, and he got 2 starts last year going 1-1, losing on the road at Notre Dame, but he had 450 total yards in that game. If you watched that game, you know he was not the reason they didn't win that game. So he appears to be ready to step right into that Clemson offense and keep it rolling at the same pace it was on under Trevor Lawrence. I don't expect much of a step backwards in terms of quarterback play at Clemson from what they had to what they're getting with DJ Ukulele. I think the bigger loss for Clemson is Travis Etienne. Let's just be honest. They're not replacing him. I don't care who's on their roster. They're not Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne's the all-time leading rusher in the ACC. Might have been the best player on that team. It probably would have been the best player on that team every year he was there, were it not for Trevor Lawrence. But he was absolutely unbelievable. And that doesn't mean Clemson doesn't have any talented running backs. I mean, yeah, they'll be okay at the running back position, but they're not replacing Travis Etienne. So that loss will hurt them. On the defense, they get every single starter back. I mean, everybody comes back on defense. So Clemson will be as good or better, in my opinion, in 2021 as they were in 2020. Flip it over, take a look at Georgia. Of course, they get JT Daniels back, now year 2 in that offense under Todd Monken. Every single Georgia wide receiver comes back. All of the running backs are back. The majority of the offensive line is back. So Georgia gets a ton back on offense. It's kind of an opposite situation of Clemson. Clemson gets their whole defense back, has to replace a bunch on offense. Georgia gets their whole offense back, but has to replace a bunch on defense, mainly the secondary, which is a concern heading into this game. Clemson's going to sling the ball around with Ukulele. You combine that with the fact that they lost ETN. I expect Clemson to come out and try to sling the ball on UGA against a young secondary. Our 4 top corners from last year are no longer on the team. 3 off to the NFL, 1 transferred to Miami. Georgia's got talent, but it's unproven talent. Most of the defensive backs you'll see in that game against Clemson have yet to take a snap or play a snap at the University of Georgia. So we'll see how that goes week 1. But clearly that's a matchup everyone's looking forward to. It'll be a matchup of 2 top 5 teams. My best guess right now, Clemson's going to be somewhere in the top 2 or 3. Georgia's going to be somewhere in the top 4 or 5. It'll be a matchup of 2 top 5 teams to kick things off for college football in 2021. You'll be watching the game. You know you will. I will too. That'll be a good one. Let's move on to week 2. And now here's something you don't see very often in college football. A non-con matchup in the regular season between 2 teams that each won their conference title game the year before. And of course, I'm talking about Oregon at Ohio State, week 2, September 11th. This was supposed to be the second part of a home-and-home series between Oregon and Ohio State. Last year's matchup, of course, canceled because we couldn't have any non-con games. But Ohio State, of course, went through the Big Ten undefeated, winning the Big Ten title yet again, won a playoff game before losing in the national title game. And of course, Oregon, although they did not win their division, still made it into the Pac-12 title game because Washington, who did win the Pac-12 North, had to forfeit that game because of coronavirus issues within their team. So Oregon got to play in the Pac-12 title game instead of Washington, and Oregon won it. They then went on to lose their bowl game. I think it was the Fiesta Bowl to Iowa State. Wasn't even close. Ohio State had a year like most people thought Ohio State would have. Oregon, to me, even though they won the Pac-12, had a disappointing season. They were 4-3, so 4-2 in the regular season, winning the Pac-12 title game, losing the bowl game to finish at 4-3. A disappointing 4-3, though, in my opinion. A couple of games early in the season, they won a couple of games that really they should have lost. They just looked real sloppy. They were never really able to get anything consistently going on offense, which sounds weird to say when you're talking about Oregon because you sort of think offense when you think about Oregon, at least over the last 10 or 15 years, going back even to the Chip Kelly days. They were a little disappointing. Mario Cristobal has recruited at a really, really good level there at Oregon. Not an Ohio State level, but when you compare the Oregon recruiting to anyone else in the Pac-12, with the exception of maybe Southern Cal, it's just miles better. And that didn't show on the field last year. Now, maybe you blame that on the Rona or no offseason or whatever the case, but the point is, even though they won the Pac-12, they were they were definitely the most disappointing Power 5 conference champion last year. With all that being said, I do think this has potential to be a great game. Ohio State's got to replace Justin Fields and some other key parts, including both their running backs. Ohio State's defense was suspect at best last year, really with the exception of the Clemson game. Ohio State's defense played great somehow against Clemson, not so great in any other game. They've got to get better on the defensive side of the ball and replace some key parts on offense. Oregon thought they had their quarterback of the future last year. There's Tyler Shuck. He was a first-year starter last year. He has recently decided to transfer and leave Oregon. So Oregon's going to have a brand new quarterback for the second year in a row heading into the 2021 season. We'll see how that works out. But I think this is a game people will be excited to watch. Oregon at Ohio State in week 2. Also in week 2, another Pac-12 versus Big Ten matchup. The Pac-12 and the Big Ten have some sort of arrangement where they've agreed to play a series of non-con games over the next few years. So we get Washington at Michigan. Washington was 3-1 last year, like I mentioned before. They actually won the Pac-12 North, but were unable to play in the Pac-12 title game due to some corona issues. They play at Michigan, who was had another disappointing season, maybe the most disappointing yet under Jim Harbaugh, going 2-4 last year. They started 1-0, Michigan did, with what appeared at the time to be a big win against Minnesota. And if you remember watching that game, you were like, oh my God, Michigan has found a quarterback. Now, that ended up not to be the case. He got benched later in the year, but Michigan looked great week 1. Then they lost 4 of their next 5 games, and honestly, they almost lost all 5. They ended up beating Rutgers in, I think, double overtime. That was the only win they had in their next 5 games. So start 1-0, finish 2-4. Very disappointing year for Michigan. They decided to rework Jim Harbaugh's contract. Yeah, they gave him an extension, but that's not really what you need to be paying attention to when you read the story on Jim Harbaugh, Michigan, and his extension. His buyout was lowered. That was the goal for Michigan, was to get his buyout lowered. They don't really care about how many years. These contracts are meaningless anyway. I think this could potentially be Jim Harbaugh's last year in Michigan if things don't go well. There's not really another reason to try to lower a coach's buyout unless you're thinking about getting rid of him. He's been there for a while now. Has been unable to get over the hump in terms of beating Ohio State or winning the division. So we'll see. But this is an interesting matchup that we don't get to see very often against one team, Washington, who was pretty good last year. Another team, Michigan, who seems like is perpetually knocking on the door of top 10, top 15 status and never really seems to be able to get through it. We'll see. But this is a game we don't get to see very often, and I think it's pretty interesting. All right, also in week 2, September 11th, this might be one of the most interesting. Remember I said this is, to me, these are the most interesting, not necessarily the best games. This might be the most interesting non-con game of the entire season. Texas at Arkansas. Now, this game has so many layers to it, it's hard to really even explain them all. But Texas and Arkansas, of course, have played a ton. Did I write down? Texas leads the all-time series 56-22. So they've played, what is that, 78 times these two teams have played. You got to go back to the Southwestern Conference days, right, when they played almost every single year up through the 90s or so, I think. Texas, well, just think about this. Texas was 7-3 last year. That's not terrible, right? Now, I get Texas and the expectations, and I understand all that. But just in general, when you look at the way last year went with the Rona and all this, that, and everybody playing conference games, 7-3 is not terrible. Yet they fire the entire coaching staff. Oh, my God, the sky is falling. We can't have this. This is unacceptable. Everybody's got to go. They bring in Steve Sarkisian from Alabama. He's the flavor of the week now at Texas after a 7-3 record. Then look at Arkansas. They went 3-7. And people are talking about Arkansas like they had one of the best years of any team around. Now, why is this? Expectations, right? Texas has higher expectations. And the coach, Tom Herman, just was never able to meet those expectations. They had the 2018 year where they almost won the Big 12 and then beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. That was clearly the highlight of the Tom Herman era at Texas. And honestly, beating Georgia is the biggest win Texas has had since they won the national title. If you don't believe me, just ask a Texas fan. They love to talk about that game. Arkansas, on the other hand, hadn't won an SEC game in 2 years. They put out the SEC's 10-game schedule, and people were looking at it, and they went, oh, my God, Arkansas has the hardest schedule in the history of college football, and they just penciled them in for 0-10 without even thinking about it. The college football season starts. Georgia travels to take on Arkansas in week 1, and Arkansas was winning at halftime. Now, I know games are 2 halves, and the game ended up not being close, but people looked at that game and they went, wow, Sam Pittman might have something going here at Arkansas. Now, they ended up only going 3-7, but they had an opportunity to win a couple of more of those games that they lost, and more importantly, they were just competitive in more games overall than they had been in really the last 2 or 3 years. So you have a team in Texas who went 7-3, but people's opinions of them really is heading down. And then you have a team like Arkansas who went 3-7, but somehow people look at them like they had a pretty good year. It just goes to show you how expectations can really shape your opinions or thoughts of a team, right? Anyway, so these are 2 teams that haven't played in a while. They used to play every single year. 2 teams that are sort of at least public opinion has them heading in opposite directions. I think it'll be an interesting. Game. It's one that most of us will watch. Honestly, I'm not sure why I have this one on the list. Well, yeah, I am. I do know why. Pitt at Tennessee, also week 2, September 11th. Both teams should be 1-0 heading into this one. Tennessee plays Bowling Green week 1, and there's been some jokes going around that, better not sleep on Bowling Green. And I get it. Tennessee's not really in a position where they can overlook anybody. But Bowling Green is absolutely terrible. Weren't they winless last year? Did I write this down? Yeah. They were 0-5 last year, and you say, well, coronavirus. Okay, well, the year before that, they were 3-9. They're a terrible team. Tennessee should beat them. I know they got a new coaching staff and no talent, and 25 players into the transfer portal, and literally nobody with a heartbeat wants to play there or be associated with that program in any way at all. And they brought in a coach from Central Florida that's not any good and had them headed in the wrong direction from what he got left from Scott Frost. But nevertheless, I digress. The reason this is on the on the list is it just will be hilarious if Tennessee loses. Pitt's not a great team. What they do last year, they went 6-5. Pitt's one of these teams in the ACC that they're not very good, right? They're pretty much a 500 team. Now, every once in a while, they will win 7 or 8 games. Why? Because 10 of the 14 teams in the ACC are 500 teams, and they play each other, so you have to win some of those games. So every once in a while, they'll put together a 7 or 8 win season. But they're pretty much a 500 team. If you just look at them over the last 10 years, they're not a very good team. These two teams do have some history. Pitt actually leads the all-time series 2-0. Both those games were played in the early 80s when Pitt was pretty good and Tennessee was, well, Tennessee. So it'll be funny if Tennessee loses this game for obvious reasons on this channel. But these are two teams we haven't seen play in a long, long time. And it's Tennessee's first chance against a Power 5 opponent with that new head coach from Central Florida, Josh Heupel. All right, moving on to week 3, which will be September 18th. What about Auburn at Penn State? This seems like a game we would see in the Outback Bowl, the Capital One Bowl, or one of these bowl games that seems to match the SEC versus the Big Ten every single year, right? But we get it sort of in the middle of the season here. Week 3, Auburn at Penn State. Auburn was 6-5 last year. Penn State was 4-5. You guys remember the Penn State debacle last year. They started 0-5. Tale of 2 seasons for Penn State. They started the year 0-5. I don't know how much money you could have made if you would have placed a bet before the season started that Penn State was going to start 0-5. But Penn State starts 0-5, finishes 4-0 for an overall record of 5-4. Still very disappointing. Auburn clearly disappointing as well with the 6-5 record. They finally get rid of Gus Malzahn, a move that sort of seemed like it was in the making for a couple of years, really. Auburn had a pretty good year in 2017 with Malzahn. They won the SEC West with 2 big wins over Georgia and Alabama to close out the season. Then they lost the SEC title game rematch to Georgia and went on to lose the Peach Bowl to Central Florida. And Auburn thought it would be a good idea at that time to give Gus Malzahn a huge and ridiculous raise and extension, paying him almost $50 million for a 7-year contract. Fast forward 1 year to 2018 at the end of the season, and they were ready to fire him, but they couldn't afford it. Fast forward to the end of 2019, they were ready to fire him, but they couldn't afford it. Fast forward to the end of 2020, they were ready to fire him, and finally, they scrounged up the money to do it. So they get rid of Gus Malzahn. They bring in the kid from Boise State, Harrison, whatever his name is. Him and Heupel, to me, really birds of the same feather. You've got Heupel takes over a great team at Central Florida, sends them in the wrong direction. Heupel lost more games each year he was at Central Florida. He inherited an undefeated team, lost like 1 game the year after, 3 games the year after that, and like 4 or 5 games last year. Then you look at the guy at Boise State. He didn't really tank the program, but he didn't elevate it either. The program was at a certain level when he got there, and it sort of stayed at that level. Nothing really impressive there at Boise State. And a huge, I don't know if there's a bigger step up in competition you can take than going from Boise State's schedule year in and year out to finding yourself in the SEC West. Good luck to him is all I can say. Auburn at Penn State series is tied all-time 1-1. They haven't played since the 2003 Capital One Bowl, so almost 20 years since we saw this matchup. Auburn at Penn State, September 18th. Now, I think this is the only team I have on here twice. September 18th, Cincinnati at Indiana. Now, I get it that this isn't a very sexy matchup. It probably won't attract a whole lot of eyeballs. But Indiana was a pretty good team last year within the Big Ten. They gave Ohio State all they could handle in their regular season matchup. And Cincinnati, of course, went 9-0 before losing to Georgia in one of the best bowl games of the season, and finishing 9-1. Indiana 6-2 last year, right? They host Cincinnati. Now, this is going to be a good game. Cincinnati. Let's stop this right now. You know my thoughts on the group of 5 making the playoffs. Okay, I don't think it's ever going to happen until the playoffs are extended past 4 teams, and I think it could happen. This might be the best chance anyone has ever had to make it, though. Cincinnati was undefeated last year before losing on literally the last second to Georgia on a field goal, a top 10 team, Georgia. Now, this year, they get a chance at Indiana. I think they could win that game. Later, they play at Notre Dame. And that game's on this list too, so we might as well just talk about them both at the same time. But Cincinnati at Notre Dame on October 2nd. Now, I know how everybody feels about Notre Dame, and I get it. But the point is, if Cincinnati goes undefeated, 12-0, wins a conference title game, 13-0, and they're sitting there with wins at Indiana and at Notre Dame, it's possible. I still don't think it's likely. But man, it is possible, and it's going to be hard to explain why they aren't in that final top 4 playoff poll. Now, I know a lot of this depends on what happens in the other conferences and what the records are and all these kinds of things, but Cincinnati's likely going to start the season in the top 10. And if they don't lose a game, and along the way, they beat 2 pretty good Power 5 teams at Indiana, at Notre Dame, and they're sitting there at the end of the year 13-0 with a close loss to Georgia the year before that they can point to as proof that they belong, it's going to be hard to keep them out. For that reason, to me, these are 2 of the most interesting non-con games of the year. Cincy at Indiana on September 18th and Cincy at Notre Dame on October 2nd. All right, the last game I have on this list, and again, this is in no order. This is one I can't wait to see. Rekindling one of the greatest college football rivalries, in my opinion, in the history of college football. Nebraska at Oklahoma, September 18th. Nebraska, of course, 3-5 last year. Utterly disappointing under Scott Frost. More on that in a second. Oklahoma, 9-2. Oklahoma lost 2 of their first 3 games last year, and we forgot all about them. We wrote them off. We pointed and laughed. Ha, ha, ha. They didn't lose another game. They demolished Florida in the bowl game. I know Florida had half their team sitting out. Oklahoma was one of the hottest teams in America at the end of the year, period. Oklahoma was probably one of the 4 best teams last year. You got to remember, the playoff committee, they're not putting in the 4 best teams. It's a combination of best and deserving. And because Oklahoma lost 2 of their first 3, that was it. They were done. But at the end of the year, there weren't 4 teams better than Oklahoma. There weren't. They get everybody back, including Spencer Rattler. But I mean, the reason this game is interesting is because these 2 teams played every single year for 100 years or whatever it was. Back in the, forever. And then Nebraska leaves, joins the Big Ten, and that was it. The series was over. Let's see. This series, 45-38 all time in favor of Oklahoma. They last played in the 2010 Big 12 title game, and Oklahoma won. Oklahoma, like I mentioned, lost 2 of their first 3 games last year, went on to win the rest of them. Nebraska, on the other hand, a typical Scott Frost year, unfortunately, with Nebraska. Is Scott Frost on the hot seat this year? We really need to start asking that question. I know he's only been there 3 years now. This will be his 4th year. No improvement. I haven't seen any improvement at Nebraska from the time Scott Frost got there till now. They're paying him a lot of money, and the results do not justify the paycheck up to this point. Look at Scott Frost's record in his first 3 years at Nebraska. 4-8 in his first year, that's a freebie year. You say, well, they'll get better. Yeah, they got better year 2. They went from 4-8 to 5-7. Not acceptable, in my opinion. Not acceptable. And then last year, 3-5. Okay, Rona. So you throw that out too. He better find a way to make a bowl game this year is all I got to say. He better win 7 games this year. The 3 years before Scott Frost got there, Mike Riley was the coach. Here was Mike Riley's record in his 3 years at Oklahoma. 6-7, 9-4, 4-8. Scott Frost has done worse than Mike Riley. You fired Mike Riley for good reason, in my opinion. You brought in Scott Frost and paid him a ton of money. And you're worse now than when he got there. At least if you go by the records. I mean, at least Mike Riley had a 9-win season. Yeah, he had a 4-8 season, and so did Scott Frost, but his other season was 6-7. That's better than Scott Frost's other season at 5-7. Scott Frost better. It's time to poop or get off the pot. If you're Scott Frost, one good way to do it would be to win this old rivalry game against Oklahoma. This isn't a prediction video, but that ain't going to happen, though. Oklahoma's going to steamroll them. So if you're Scott Frost or Nebraska, forget this game. Try to find 7 other games you can win. This ain't one of them. All right, that's the 10 I'm looking forward to the most. And listen, there's 100 other non-conference games that I can't wait to watch. Here's the original list I made. I'll read you some of the other ones off the list that I think have potential to be interesting games. Louisiana versus Texas. And I'm not talking about LSU. I'm talking about the Raging Cajuns. They had some Power 5 wins last year. Texas, no Sam Ehlinger, brand new coaching staff. This will be the Super Bowl for Louisiana. Texas is going to get the absolute best punch Louisiana can throw. What a disaster if Texas loses that game. We'll see. I think it'll be interesting. Notre Dame versus Wisconsin. Is this in Chicago? I can't remember if is this in Chicago or Green Bay? It's in one of those two I think it's in Chicago. Anyway, doesn't matter. That'll be an interesting game. Notre Dame versus Wisconsin. Liberty versus Ole Miss. Might not seem like a very interesting game until you remember, oh yeah, Liberty's head coach, Hugh Freeze, that human scumbag, making a return trip to Oxford, this time on the away sideline. Liberty versus Ole Miss. Ole Miss year 2 under Lane Kiffin, high-flying offense. Hugh Freeze, great year last year at Liberty. Could be an interesting game. We'll see. What else is on this list? Michigan State versus Miami, another one where this was supposed to be the second game of a home and home. Couldn't play last year's version, so they're playing this one at Miami. Michigan State at Miami. Miami needs to win that game. Michigan State year 2 under Mel Tucker. Michigan State was better last year than I thought they would be. And I'm not even talking about their record. I just mean if you watched them play, they were a little bit better last year than what I thought they would be. They were really bad the last couple of years under D'Antonio. I wasn't that high on Mel Tucker. I don't know that he really, quote unquote, deserved that job, but nevertheless, he got it. I thought they were a little bit better last year than I thought they would be. Not as good as Miami, though. We already talked about Miami earlier. Ton coming back. Miami better win that game. It's at home for Miami. You can't lose that game. You got to win it. Virginia Tech at West Virginia. Another game that we don't see all that often. Geographical rivals, if nothing else, right? Virginia Tech at West Virginia. Army versus Navy. You can't make a non-con list without putting Army Navy on it. The game comes on very end of the year. No other games are on that day. It's the weekend after the conference championship games. Usually everyone watches it. If you don't, you're not American. Yeah. What about Utah versus BYU? The Holy War. Utah, sort of the sleeper pick every year in the Pac-12 South. Although I don't know why people consider them a sleeper anymore. They're probably the best program in the Pac-12 South right now. Utah versus BYU. Texas A&M in Colorado. SEC versus Pac-12. Pac-12 needs some big non-con wins. They got a chance with the Oregon-Ohio State matchup. They got a chance with the Washington-Michigan matchup. Here's another chance here. Colorado at Texas A&M. I don't know. I know Texas A&M loses Kellen Mond, but they've recruited pretty well. I like the way they looked last year. Jimbo Fisher now, been there for a while. Texas A&M probably be a significant favorite in that game. Central Florida at Boise State. Let's give the Power 5 some credit. They don't dodge or avoid anybody. They'll play up in the power. They'll play anybody that'll play them in the Power 5. When they can't fill their schedule up with Power 5 non-con opponents, they go out and schedule the best of the best within the group of 5. These are consistently 2 of the best teams in the group of 5 over the last 15 years. Central Florida at Boise State. LSU at UCLA, another SEC versus Pac-12 matchup. Chip Kelly now at UCLA. This will be what, his 3rd year. They were better last year too than I thought they would be. I had wrote them off. Chip Kelly's lost it, whatever. I was wrong. They looked a little bit better last year than I thought they would. LSU looked worse even than I thought they would. But there are plenty of legitimate excuses as to why LSU had a rough season. That being said, they can't afford a loss here. Not after what they did last year. The Corn Dogs are restless there in Baton Rouge. And if you lose this game on the road to an average at best UCLA team, you can expect the heat to be turned up on Ed Orgeron, even when he won a national title a couple of years ago. Oklahoma State at Boise State. Now, they did play this past season, didn't they? Or was that 2 seasons ago? Might have been this past season. Anyway, that'll be an interesting game. And Iowa at Iowa State. Another big rivalry game that we see every year that we didn't get to see this past year because of the coronavirus. Iowa, I mean, they're going to finish 18th every single year, aren't they? I mean, doesn't it just seem like they finish 18th every year? If I told you Iowa was going to go 8-4 and finish 18th, would you argue? Without even looking at their schedule or their roster or their recruiting or anything. If I just said Iowa's going 8-4 and finishing 18th, you'd probably go, yeah, that sounds about right. Iowa State, of course, top 10 team last year, almost won the Big 12, or had a chance to win the Big 12. They get everybody back. Matt Campbell, one of the hottest young coaches in America. Iowa State's going to be probably top 10 or top 12 at the worst in all these preseason polls that come out. They're a better team than Iowa, but Iowa's beat them like 4 or 5 years in a row. So we'll see. Iowa State looks like the favorite right now, but you never know what happens in these rivalry games. There you go. There's a bunch more too. I didn't intentionally leave any games out or off this list. I could talk about non-con games for 5 or 6 hours straight, and I don't know. Maybe one day I will. But until that day comes, this video will have to do. Have a great morning.